They said the old war bunker in Pine Ridge was worthless, just rust, silence, and ghosts. But when a weary veteran named Jack and his loyal dog Buddy stepped inside, something ancient stirred. Why did the air feel alive? Why were the walls warm, as if waiting for someone to return? What they found beneath the mountain wasn't a weapon or gold. It was a secret built by men trying to heal the world they once broke. And how Jack chose to honor that secret would change not only his life, but an entire town. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city below and subscribe for more true stories of hope, healing, and the courage to start again. Morning came slowly to Pine Ridge, Colorado. Mist pooled between the pines, and the first light of day slipped through branches silvered by frost. The air carried that mix of pine resin and iron that always follows a cold night. A woodpecker drummed somewhere far off, and the sound echoed softly through the valley, steady, patient, the way life tries again after silence. Jack Miller paused beside his truck, mug of coffee steaming in his gloved hands. At 47, he had the kind of face that had forgotten how to pretend, angular, wind-creased, honest. His dark brown hair was touched by gray at the temples, and a thin line of beard traced his jaw like a memory he hadn't bothered to shave away. His eyes were gray-green, the color of river stones, and when he looked out across the trees, he looked as if he could hear things no one else did. A soft scrape came from behind him. Buddy, the German shepherd who had followed him through a war and then through the quieter battles of home, stretched and shook off sleep. 6 years old, broad-shouldered, sable-coated, with a faint scar on his rib where shrapnel once grazed him. Around his neck hung a worn brass tag, Adopted, Lackland AFB. Jack smiled faintly and dropped a piece of toast into the dog's bowl. Breakfast, soldier. Buddy wagged once, then settled to eat. Beyond the porch rail sat a chipped saucer of milk. A stray orange cat from town sometimes came by. Jack never chased it off. He liked the idea that something else still trusted the quiet of this place. For 2 years he'd lived alone in this cabin on the edge of the forest, mending fences, repairing engines, clearing snow from old neighbors' drives. Folks in Pine Ridge called him polite but distant, the kind of man who tipped his hat but never stayed for coffee. He wasn't unkind, he simply didn't know how to be part of noise anymore. When the wind rose too fast or a car backfired down Main Street, his chest tightened. Once, even the hiss of the percolator had sent him to his knees, because it sounded too much like the sand furnace from the night the convoy burned. Sometimes he woke gasping, heart racing, until Buddy climbed onto the bed and pressed his head against Jack's chest, listening, waiting for the rhythm to calm. Machines could be repaired. People took longer. That morning, the town clerk, Mary Ann Heller, had asked for volunteers to help clear old government files. Jack drove into town out of habit more than purpose. Maybe, he told himself, to fix something that stayed fixed for once. The county records building was small and leaning, its windows fogged from an aging heater. Mary Ann, red-haired, round-shouldered, early 50s, looked up from behind a clutter of folders. "Well, look who the wind blew in. Sergeant Miller, I thought you were allergic to paperwork." "Guess I'm facing my fears," Jack said, voice dry but polite. She laughed. "You sure you want the dust? No pay in this. Job?" "Dust doesn't talk back," he replied, and she smiled at that. They spent the next hour shifting boxes, her humming old country tunes while he worked. At one point, she handed him a faded folder, stamped surplus property, decommissioned. "Half these places were abandoned after the war," she said. "Most got sold for scrap. A few nobody wanted. You wouldn't believe how many old bunkers and radio posts are buried in these hills." Jack thumbed through until one entry stopped him. Military installation, Air Force 7229, Pine Ridge Signal, Relay Bunker. Built 1943, decommissioned 1946. Property available under Veteran Maintenance Reuse Program. Fee, $1. He stared at the words longer than he meant to. A bunker. Silence thick enough to breathe. "This one's still around?" he asked. Marianne adjusted her glasses. "Technically, yes. No one's touched it in decades. Government tried to give it away under that caretaker program, cheaper than demolition. You thinking of applying?" Jack looked at the photo clipped to the form. A concrete door half buried in earth, ivy curling like veins across it. Something about it felt familiar. Not the place, but the stillness. He said almost to himself, "Maybe the earth's the only roof that never leaks." Marianne frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning I'll take it." She blinked. "You serious?" He nodded once. "I've got time. Figure I could keep it from falling apart." Marianne hesitated, then slid the form across. "You'll need to check it twice a year, file a report. Don't go digging for treasure." Jack signed. His handwriting was slow, each letter steady like he was measuring the distance between then and now. When she stamped approved pending pickup, she studied him. "You really plan to stay out there?" He gave a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Not stay, just listen." Outside, a delivery boy rode past on a bicycle, shouting the day's headlines. The world kept moving. Jack didn't. He stood a moment under the courthouse awning, rain starting to fall in thin diagonal lines. Buddy waited by the truck, head tilted as if asking whether this was another repair job or something else. 2 days later, they followed the old logging road until the trees thickened and the ground turned soft with moss. Jack left the truck where the path ended and walked the rest. The forest grew quieter with every step. Even Buddy's breathing seemed to match the wind. At last they found it, a slab of concrete sunk into the hillside, door sealed by a chain the color of rusted blood. The sign above it barely clung to the bolts. U.S. property, authorized personnel, only. Jack brushed away the moss and ran his hand over the letters. Cold metal, colder memory. Buddy sniffed the air, tail stiff but curious. "Well, boy," Jack murmured, "looks like the world forgot this place." He pried the chain loose with a crowbar. The sound rang. Through the trees, sharp, metallic, final. When the door groaned open, a breath of stale air drifted out, tinged with oil and time. Inside waited darkness, but not the kind that frightened him. This darkness was heavy, sure, almost merciful. He flicked on his flashlight. Dust floated like faint snow. Concrete walls stretched inward, pipes overhead weeping rust. Each step downward softened the world behind him. Halfway down the stairs, Buddy stopped, ears twitching. A draft moved through the vent above them, whispering like faraway wind. Jack froze, then smiled faintly. "Just air, partner." At the bottom lay a corridor of peeling paint, a door marked Operations. He pushed it open, the hinges sighed. Inside stood desks warped with age, papers fused by damp, an overturned chair. A single glass ashtray still held the ghost of a cigarette. He imagined a young operator once sitting there, waiting for a transmission that never came. Jack set his flashlight on the table and lowered himself onto a crate. The bunker smelled of rust and earth, of endings that had learned to rest. Buddy circled once and lay down, tail sweeping the dust aside. For a long while, neither moved. The silence settled around them like a blanket. Jack let his shoulders drop, his breath lengthen. Maybe this is what peace sounds like, he thought. Not the absence of memory, but its gentler echo. He glanced at Buddy, whose eyes glowed amber in the half-light. "Think we'll like it here?" he whispered. The dog's ears flicked, then he rested his head on his paws. In that stillness, Jack heard, or thought he heard, the faintest murmur coming through the vent, something between wind and a voice, soft and distant, as if the earth itself were saying, "Welcome home." Jack closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the ringing in his head eased. Outside, the forest swayed, and the mist carried the sound of rain across the mountains, gentle, forgiving, alive. Morning returned to Pine Ridge wrapped in a low, colorless fog. The forest glistened as if the night had wept over it. Jack stood before the bunker's door again, his breath showing in the chill, the key still warm from his palm. Moss veined the concrete like old scars, and when he turned the handle, the door exhaled the same cold air that had slept inside for decades. Buddy went first, tail low, nose working the air. His fur was darker in the beam of the flashlight, the sable catching a faint metallic gleam. Jack followed, stepping carefully down the narrow concrete stairs, each bootfall ringing like a question that hadn't been asked yet. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence grew. It wasn't just absence of sound, it was pressure, like the weight of forgotten years. The corridor stretched before them, its walls lined with ancient cables and peeling olive paint. Jack's light slid over old metal lockers, gas masks, a clipboard still hanging by a single nail. He caught a faint vibration under his boots. He stopped, crouched, and placed his palm against the floor. There, a hum, deep and steady, like the distant pulse of machinery. He frowned. "No power since 1946, he murmured. Yet somewhere, something still breathed. Buddy whined softly, ears twitching. They passed a door half ajar. Stale air spilled out with the scent of dust and rust. The next hallway dipped down into a smaller passage, tighter, colder. Jack's flashlight beam caught the glint of moisture on the ceiling. Then he saw it. A door cleaner than the rest, the handle polished by use. "Stay," he whispered. Buddy froze beside him. The door creaked open with reluctant grace. The beam swept across a small square room, barely 15 feet wide, but different from everything above it. The walls were smooth, the floor swept clean. On a table sat a metal cup with a ring of water dried into its base. An ashtray held a half-burned cigarette. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and oil. Jack stood motionless. It wasn't just that the room was clean. It was lived in. Pinned to the far wall, under a cracked plastic cover, a sheet of yellowed paper caught the light. He stepped closer and read aloud in a low voice. "Pressure check. Okay. E. Walsh, May 7th. He blinked, his voice almost a whisper. "May 7th? That's last month." The echo of his words faded into the concrete. Buddy sniffed at the chair, then backed away, growling low. Jack shut off the flashlight and waited. Nothing moved, but the hum beneath the floor went on, soft and steady. He stepped out, locked the door, and climbed back toward daylight. The morning sun was already fading behind clouds. He looked back at the hillside. The door, hidden beneath vines and pine shadows, looked less like an entrance and more like a mouth that had swallowed too many secrets. That night, he stayed in the caretaker cabin, a square shelter built beside a slope of granite. Rain came again, first a drizzle, then a whispering rhythm against the tin roof. Buddy slept near the door, muscles tense even in rest. Jack sat at the table, reading through a bundle of papers he'd found in the bunker's entryway. Maintenance ledgers, typed in neat columns. The last official entry was dated 1946, but in the back, between two brittle pages, a single note had been added in blue ink. Generator inspected, air pressure stable. Will return next month. E.W. The handwriting was shaky but recent. Jack's brows furrowed. "This place wasn't supposed to exist anymore," he muttered. Outside, thunder rolled low across the hills. He set down the paper, leaned back, and listened. The rhythm of rain almost lulled him until Buddy's head snapped up. The dog's ears pointed toward the door. Jack froze. There it was, faint but certain, the sound of boots on wet ground. Slow, measured steps. Buddy growled, the low warning that came before his bark. The latch rattled. Then the door opened a few inches, letting in a shaft of yellow light. A voice followed, gravelly, worn by age but steady. "Easy, son. I'm not here to scare you." Jack stood, his hand near the tool he kept by the table. In the doorway stood an old man, tall, slightly stooped, with a full head of white hair slicked back by rain. His face was a map of wrinkles, his beard a few days too long, his clothes heavy canvas faded to gray. A dented engineer's badge still clung to his breast pocket. U.S. Army Signal Corps. Buddy's growl softened into curiosity. Jack lowered his hand. "You're trespassing," he said quietly. The old man gave a tired smile. "So are you, depending on who you ask." He stepped inside, closed the door behind him. "Name's Eugene Walsh. You found my note, I guess." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You're the one maintaining that place?" Eugene nodded once. He moved like someone used to fixing delicate things, careful, slow, precise. "My father built part of that bunker. After the war, he told me to keep it breathing. Air pressure, water lines, generators, small things, but important. He said one day, someone honest would come along, someone who'd listen." Jack crossed his arms. "And you think that's me?" Eugene looked at Buddy. "The dog trusts you. That's a start." The rain drummed harder, soft thunder echoing across the valley. Jack poured coffee, handed him a cup. Eugene accepted with a nod, his hands trembling only slightly. "I'm 78, he said, "and I've spent 50 years making sure that place didn't drown in its own silence. There's something buried deeper than any blueprint shows, lower chamber sealed in rock. My father called it the heart. Never let it flood, he said. Never let it die." Jack leaned forward. "What's inside?" Eugene shook his head. "Could be records, could be ghosts. My father never told me. Maybe he didn't know, but he swore it mattered." Buddy shifted closer, resting, his head on Jack's knee. The room filled with the smell of wet earth and burnt coffee. For a long while, neither spoke. Finally, Jack asked, "You live near here?" Eugene gestured vaguely toward the ridge. "Got a little cabin near the timber line. Old Ford pickup gets me this far. Been using it since the Carter administration. She rattles, but she runs." Jack chuckled quietly. "You ever think of quitting?" "Every winter," Eugene said with a thin grin. "But duty's a stubborn thing. It keeps old bones moving." He set the mug down, looked at Jack. "You're a soldier, aren't you?" "Was." "I can tell. The quiet gives you away." Jack met his gaze. "You gonna stop me from checking that room again?" "No, I'm gonna show you something else instead. Tomorrow. Weather should clear by dawn." Eugene rose, joints creaking. "I'll sleep in the chair if you don't mind. Safer here than the woods tonight." Jack nodded. "Long as you don't snore." That earned the old man's first real laugh, a dry, startled sound that made Buddy tilt his head as if amused. When morning came, the air had turned crisp and the fog thinned to ribbons drifting through the trees. Eugene was already outside, checking the bunker's hinges, his breath fogging the cold air. Buddy trailed behind him, nose twitching, tail sweeping low. Jack stepped out, tightening his jacket. "You ever gonna tell me what we're really keeping alive down there?" Eugene looked at him over his shoulder. "Maybe when you can hear it." "Hear what?" "The hum," the old man said simply. "It's been there all my life. It's not power, it's memory. Don't you feel it?" Jack hesitated, then listened. Beneath the chirp of birds and drip of melting rain, there it was. A faint vibration in the ground, like the slow heartbeat of something ancient refusing to stop. He met Eugene's eyes. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think I do." They stood together at the entrance, the two of them and the dog, the wind moving gently through the trees. Then Eugene turned the key, and the bunker opened once more, not as an artifact, but as something alive, breathing in time with them. For the first time, Jack didn't flinch when the dark breathed back. The morning light had not yet broken through the pines when Jack and Eugene descended into the bunker again. The air was cool and dry, with the faint metallic tang of oil and rust. Buddy padded quietly beside them, nails clicking softly against the steps. Jack carried a small toolbox and a coil of wire. Eugene, moving slower but steady, held a lantern that cast a wavering amber glow across the walls. Dust motes danced in the light, like the memories of men long gone. Eugene Walsh, at 78, looked as though time had carved him out of the same granite that surrounded the bunker. His frame was still tall, but his shoulders curved slightly from years bent over machinery. The skin on his hands was tough as old leather, freckled and veined from decades of work. He had the calm patience of an engineer, the kind of man who measured twice and spoke once. His blue eyes, sharp but tired, gave the impression of someone who had seen too much of what others preferred to forget. As they reached the main corridor, Jack noticed Eugene pause and run his fingers along the wall. "This place," the old man said, his voice rasped by age and cigarettes, "was built by a unit called Carter Division. Officially, they were just signal engineers. Unofficially, they built shelters for things that weren't supposed to exist. My father was one of them, and his father before him." Jack raised his flashlight toward the pipes overhead. "You mean your family's been keeping this place alive since the war?" Eugene nodded. "That's right. My father said the day they sealed the last chamber, the men of Carter Division made a promise that whatever was buried down here would stay hidden until the world learned to deserve it." Jack frowned. "And you kept that promise?" Eugene looked at him. "Still am. That's why I came last night. This isn't a place you own, son. It's one you watch over. That's what my father called it, keeping watch." Buddy sniffed along the edges of the corridor, tail moving slowly. Jack crouched and scratched the dog's head. "Guess we're all watchers now, huh, boy?" The old man smiled faintly. "He's a good one. Service dog?" "Yeah," Jack said. "We did 2 tours. He still wakes me when the dreams come." Eugene's expression softened. "Then maybe you're the right kind of man after all. Most folks don't understand what silence costs." They worked side by side for most of the morning. Eugene showed Jack how to oil the heavy door hinges, check the pressure valves, and test the ventilation lines that still hummed faintly beneath the earth. His hands trembled only when he stopped to rest, but every motion was precise. Jack followed his rhythm easily, the mechanical work grounding him in a way that felt familiar. At one point, Jack brushed dust from a small brass plaque near the door frame. The engraving had nearly faded, but he could still read it. "Dedicated to the men of Carter Division, 1945, for those who kept faith beneath the earth." He looked up. "Your father's name here?" Eugene nodded. "And his commanding officer, Major Thomas Carter, the man the division was named after. They said he was the kind who'd shake your hand and remember your kids' names. But after the surrender, something changed. They came back quiet, like they'd seen too much. They never said what went into the lowest chamber, just that it had to be guarded." Jack said nothing. He knew that look, the kind soldiers wore when duty had outlived meaning. By noon, they took a break outside near the bunker entrance. Eugene sat on an overturned crate, lighting a cigarette with a battered Zippo engraved EW Buddy lay at his feet, eyes half closed, head resting on his paws. Jack poured coffee from a thermos and handed Eugene a cup. "You ever thought about stopping?" Jack asked. Eugene blew smoke into the cool air. "Every day for 50 years, but you don't stop when you've promised ghosts." Jack sipped his coffee, the bitterness sharp on his tongue. "What about family? Kids?" "Had a boy," Eugene said quietly. "He worked construction down in Pueblo. Lost him in '98. Scaffold collapse." His hand shook slightly as he flicked ash to the dirt. "After that, the bunker was all I had left to fix." Jack didn't speak. Words felt small beside that kind of loss. The wind moved through the trees, whispering low and long. When they went back inside, Buddy trotted ahead again, nose twitching toward the narrow vent at the end of the hall. Jack noticed it then, a faint draft, warm and steady, coming from behind a panel in the wall. He crouched, pressing his ear to it. There was the hum again, rhythmic and constant, but beneath it, a second sound, like a soft tapping, almost deliberate. "Eugene," Jack called. "You hear that?" The old man shuffled over, squinting at the vent. "Been hearing it for years. Thought it was pipes settling, maybe groundwater. But lately, it's been stronger." He pressed his palm to the wall, as if feeling for a heartbeat. Could be a secondary system still running somewhere, or something else. Buddy gave a quiet whine. Jack reached to pat him, but didn't take his eyes off the vent. "You ever open this section?" Eugene shook his head. "My father said never to." "Don't go chasing echoes," he told me. That was his way of saying some answers cost too much. Jack stared at the panel a moment longer, the instinct to pry at it tugging like an itch he couldn't scratch. But he stepped back. "All right," he said finally. "We'll check the outer valves instead." Eugene gave a slow nod. "You learn fast. Knowing when to leave things be, that's the trick." They spent the rest of the afternoon walking the perimeter, clearing vines from air vents, tightening bolts, brushing away decades of moss. Every task felt ritualistic, like polishing a gravestone. And yet there was peace in it, a rhythm that reminded Jack of days before the noise, before the desert, before the memories that never left. As the sun began to fall, painting the forest in gold, Eugene stood watching the bunker door. "You know," he said, "I used to think this place was cursed, all those years down there, alone, with only machines for company. But now, I wonder if maybe it's just waiting for the right people to listen." Jack tightened the last bolt on a hinge. "Maybe it's both." Eugene gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe." They sat together on the grass, the dog between them, watching the light fade through the trees. Two men separated by 40 years, bound by the same silence. They didn't speak again for a long while. When the first stars appeared, Eugene rose stiffly. "We'll stop for today. Tomorrow, I'll show you how to read the pressure gauges. It's not hard, just old-fashioned." Jack nodded. "I'll be here." Eugene looked at him carefully. "You remind me of my father when he was younger. Same look in the eyes, the kind that hears things most people don't." Jack smiled faintly. "That a compliment?" "Maybe a warning," Eugene said. "Depends what you do with what you hear." He turned toward the path that led up the ridge, his silhouette framed against the dying light. His old truck coughed once, twice, then rumbled to life. Before he drove off, he rolled down the window and called back, "Lock the door before you sleep. The forest has a long memory." Jack watched the taillights disappear among the pines. Buddy stood beside him, ears flicking at the night air. Somewhere behind them, deep within the bunker, the hum continued, steady, patient, alive. Jack whispered, "We'll figure it out, boy, but not tonight." Buddy leaned against his leg, warm and solid. Together, they listened as the forest settled into silence once more. The next morning broke with a pale, muted light that seemed to hesitate before touching the forest. Dew clung to every pine needle, and the air carried the cold metallic scent of stone and rain-soaked earth. Jack woke early. The fog outside the cabin drifted like slow breath. Buddy was already at the door, tail tapping softly against the floorboards, waiting. Eugene arrived an hour later in his old Ford, the truck coughing like an asthmatic mule before falling quiet. He stepped out, a thermos in one hand, a grease-stained cloth in the other. "You're up early," he said. His voice carried a rough fondness now, the kind earned by shared silence. Jack nodded. "Didn't sleep much, heard the hum again." Eugene smirked faintly. "You get used to it, or you start hearing it even when you're not here. Not sure which is worse." They descended together once more. The bunker's metal door resisted before yielding with a groan that echoed through the trees. Inside, the air was cooler, sharper, the faint vibration still alive beneath the concrete. Eugene lit his lantern, its glow mixing with Jack's flashlight to paint moving shadows on the walls. "Today," Eugene said, "we check the lower ducts, the ones feeding the air into the core chamber. Haven't looked at them in years." Jack followed him down the narrow passage where the ceiling dipped so low he had to crouch. The floor was slick in places, and Buddy walked carefully, his paws finding balance even in the dark. At the far end, they reached a grated vent half-sealed with rust and grime. Eugene knelt, prying gently with a flathead screwdriver. The metal squealed. Dust spilled out like breath released after too long. "Been closed since before my father died," he muttered. Jack crouched beside him, shining the light directly into the vent. Something inside caught the beam, a small square object wedged behind the pipework. "There's something in there." Eugene squinted. "Probably a nesting rat or an old filter. Don't bother." But Buddy had already moved closer, pawing gently at the opening, whining low. He pressed his nose against the grate, tail stiff. Jack smiled. When he does that, he's found something. He loosened 2 screws, pulled the grate free, and reached inside. His hand brushed something dry and papery, wrapped in what felt like waxed cloth. Carefully, he drew it out, a small bundle no larger than a folded map, tied with a frayed cord. The cloth had yellowed, but the knot was still firm. Eugene's breath caught. "Well, I'll be damned." Jack set it on the floor and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a metal tin, tarnished but intact. The lid creaked open to reveal a single envelope resting atop a stack of small photographs. On the envelope, written in precise, old-fashioned handwriting, were the words, "To whoever keeps the watch. T.C." Jack looked at Eugene. "T.C. Thomas Carter?" Eugene nodded, eyes wide. "Major Carter, himself. That's his handwriting." Jack lifted the letter carefully. The paper was brittle but legible, the ink browned by time. He began to read aloud. "If you are reading this, it means the world above has forgotten what we buried. This station was not built to hide weapons or gold. It was built to protect the last honest record of what men did when conscience failed. Inside the heart of this bunker is a vault sealed in concrete. Within it are letters, diaries, and orders, evidence of what happened to those we sent home, broken and unhealed. It must never be destroyed. The men of Carter Division gave their word. Keep watch, and when the time is right, let the truth breathe again." Jack's voice faltered at the end. Silence filled the corridor, broken only by the slow drip of water somewhere beyond the pipes. Eugene lowered himself to the ground, elbows on his knees, staring at the tin. "I always thought he was guarding something powerful. Never thought it'd be stories." Jack folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the tin. "Stories can be powerful," he said softly. sometimes more than bombs. They examined the photographs beneath it, faded snapshots of young men in uniform standing before the same bunker decades earlier. Their faces were sunburned but smiling. On the back of one, someone had written in pencil, "Keep the silence, keep the faith." Eugene touched the edge of the photo. His voice was thin. "That's my father, second from the left. God, he was just a kid." Buddy nuzzled against Jack's knee, as if sensing the shift in the air. The dog's amber eyes seemed to reflect both the light and the weight of what they had found. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The bunker, once merely a relic, now felt alive, a vessel of grief, of duty, of memory that had survived generations of silence. Finally, Jack said, "This should be in a museum or an archive, somewhere people can read it." Eugene shook his head. "And have them twisted into headlines and politics? No. Carter wanted this truth to be handled by hands that remember what war costs. That's not a journalist's job. That's a soldier's." Jack leaned back against the wall. "Then maybe it's ours." Eugene looked at him, the lines on his face deepening into something between weariness and relief. "Maybe it is." They sat together, lantern flickering, the air faintly humming around them. Above them, the forest swayed, unseen but present, like a patient witness. Later, when they climbed out into the fading light, Jack looked back at the bunker. It no longer seemed cold. It felt like a heartbeat under the soil, steady and waiting. Eugene exhaled, pulling his jacket tight. "You know, my father used to say some secrets aren't meant to stay buried forever, just long enough for the right person to find them." Jack glanced down at Buddy, whose tail thumped once against the ground. "Maybe he was talking about you." Eugene chuckled softly. "Or maybe about you, Sergeant. I've been the caretaker long enough. Maybe it's time someone else listened." As the sun sank behind the ridge, they started the walk back toward the cabin. The woods glowed amber in the last light. Buddy trotted ahead, stopping every few yards to look back, making sure they were following. At the cabin door, Eugene turned, his face half in shadow. "You know, Carter's letter said something else once, something my father repeated every time he left here." Jack paused. "What was it?" "The truth will only survive if it's carried by kindness." "I didn't understand it then. Maybe you will." He started the engine, and the old truck rumbled down the gravel path until the trees swallowed it whole. Inside, Jack placed the tin on the table, beside the flickering lamp. Buddy curled at his feet. The sound of the forest filled the silence, wind, crickets, the slow rhythm of night returning. Jack reached down and scratched Buddy's ear. "Guess we've got more to guard than just a bunker, huh?" The dog looked up, eyes bright in the lamplight. Somewhere below, deep in the earth, the hum went on, steady, patient, waiting for the day truth would rise again. The first snow came early that year, sweeping over Pine Ridge like a forgotten memory. Clouds gathered thick and gray, pressing low over the forest until the pines seemed to bend beneath their weight. Jack stood outside the cabin with Buddy beside him, the sky bruised with the color of iron. He could feel the change in the air before it came, the strange stillness, the charged silence that made even the dog lower his head. Eugene had been inside the bunker since morning, adjusting the pressure valves. The discovery of Major Carter's letter had left him restless. For the first time in years, he moved through the tunnels not as a caretaker, but as a man racing time. If the systems fail, he'd said, the core chamber could flood. We need to secure it before the cold locks the vents. Jack had offered to help, but Eugene had waved him off with a tired grin. "You take the top side. If the storm hits, keep the generator running. I've worked these lines all my life. I'll be fine." Now, as the first gusts of wind began to scream through the trees, Jack wasn't so sure. He checked the cables leading to the cabin's backup generator, fingers stiff from the cold. Snow started to fall, slow at first, then faster, until the forest disappeared in a white haze. Buddy paced restlessly, whining. His ears twitched toward the bunker door. Jack followed his gaze. "He's still in there," he murmured. "Damn it, old man!" The storm hit full force. Snow and ice pounded against the door, the wind roaring through the valley like something alive. Jack pulled his coat tighter and grabbed the lantern. "Stay close, boy." Together they pushed through the blizzard toward the bunker entrance. The steel door rattled as if something inside were hammering against it. Jack tried the handle. It wouldn't budge. He leaned close, shouting, "Eugene, can you hear me?" But the only answer was the moan of the storm. Inside, Eugene struggled against the failing machinery. The pressure gauge flickered wildly, the needle quivering in the red. Pipes hissed, valves clanked, and somewhere deep below, the hum of the heart chamber faltered. He turned the wheel of the main vent control, coughing as steam burst from a broken seal. His hands, once so steady, trembled. Come on," he muttered through clenched teeth. The wrench slipped, slicing his palm. Blood darkened the metal. He reached for the emergency shutoff, but the lever jammed halfway. The bunker groaned around him, a deep metallic shudder that echoed like thunder underground. Above, Buddy barked sharply, then lunged at the door, scratching, digging. Jack pulled at the latch again. "Back up, boy." He hit the side of the door with his shoulder, once, twice. It didn't move. The air seemed to tighten, the wind howling like an alarm. Then, through the blizzard, a sound rose, a high, trembling chime. Jack froze. The old wind chime Grace had hung on the cabin porch, too. Weeks earlier danced violently in the storm, its tone carrying eerily through the valley. Buddy stopped barking, head turning toward it. A moment later, the dog bolted, not toward the cabin, but toward the far end of the ridge, where a narrow ventilation pipe jutted from the snow. "Buddy!" Jack shouted, chasing after him. The German shepherd reached the vent and began barking down into it, the sound echoing through the pipes. Jack dropped to his knees beside him, the wind cutting his face raw. The chime's tone carried through the air, mixing with Buddy's barks, amplified and transformed by the vent system into a hollow, metallic song. It carried down through the tunnels and out across the valley, like a cry for help wrapped in music. Miles away, in the edge of Pine Ridge Village, Grace Turner heard it. Grace was 39, tall and willowy, with auburn hair that caught red in the lamplight. Her skin was pale from the mountain cold, her eyes a clear gray blue, sharp and kind at once. She was the town's school teacher, a widow who'd returned home after her husband's death, trying to build something steady out of the quiet. She'd hung that wind chime as a gift for Jack after seeing him and his dog fixing the fence near the post office. "For luck," she'd said with a smile that carried more warmth than she meant to show. Now, that same chime was screaming through the storm. Grace felt it deep in her chest. Something was wrong. She grabbed her coat and shouted to her neighbor, Henry Boyd, a retired fireman with a thick beard and the build of a bear. "Something's happened up at the ridge." Henry didn't argue. Within minutes, half a dozen townsfolk were trudging through the snow with ropes, lanterns, and shovels. Grace led the way, her scarf snapping behind her, determination cutting through the wind. By the time they reached the bunker, the snow was waist-deep. Jack was still pounding on the door, his voice hoarse. When he saw the lanterns through the white, he nearly collapsed with relief. "He's trapped inside!" Henry pushed forward, his breath steaming. "Step back!" With two others, he rigged a crowbar under the latch. The metal groaned, then gave way with a sharp crack. They forced the door open just enough for Jack and Buddy to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with steam and the smell of oil. Eugene lay pinned under a fallen pipe, the lantern light flickering beside him. "Still here?" he rasped. Jack dropped to his knees, gripping the old man's shoulder. "Don't move! We've got help!" Henry and two others lifted the pipe, their boots slipping on the slick floor. Grace crouched beside Eugene, brushing dust from his face. "You're all right, sir," she said softly. "Just stay with us." Eugene blinked at her through the haze, a faint smile on his cracked lips. "You sound like my wife when she was young." Grace smiled, her eyes stinging. "Then she must have been a good one." When they carried Eugene out, the snow had slowed to a whisper. The townspeople formed a line, passing lanterns, blankets, and tools hand to hand. Someone shouted, "Keep the light on the bunker! Don't let it freeze shut again!" Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the glow spread. Lanterns ringing the bunker like stars fallen to earth. For the first time, the place didn't look like a tomb. It looked alive. Buddy sat beside him, his fur dusted white, chest heaving. Jack knelt and wrapped an arm around him. "Good work, boy," he murmured. "You called them here." The dog's tail thumped once against the snow. Grace came to stand beside him, her breath visible in the cold. That sound, the chime, how did it carry that far? Jack smiled faintly. "Guess your wind chimes got more heart than we thought." She laughed softly, brushing snow from her hair. "Remind me to hang another one when this is over." As the last of the villagers drifted home, Jack and Grace stayed behind, watching Eugene rest under blankets near the fire. The old man stirred, half asleep. "You did good," he whispered. "All of you." Jack glanced at the crowd, at the light circling the bunker like a halo. "Looks like the town finally remembered what's worth saving." Grace nodded. Maybe it just needed someone to listen first. The wind had quieted, the storm passing east over the ridge. From somewhere above, the broken chime on the porch gave one last soft ring, as if closing the chapter itself. Jack looked up. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The storm had passed, leaving the valley blanketed in white silence. The snow clung to the pine boughs like memory, and the sun, weak but warm, glinted on every crystal edge. Pine Ridge woke slowly that morning, the air thick with the scent of wet bark and wood smoke. Jack stood outside the bunker entrance, his breath fogging in the early light. The steel door was rimed with frost, yet somehow it felt gentler than before, as if the storm had cleansed it of its ghosts. Buddy trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging in steady rhythm. He seemed different since the rescue, alert, purposeful, almost proud. Jack followed him into the bunker, flashlight beams slicing through the cold air. The hum that once unnerved him now felt almost like a heartbeat. Eugene, wrapped in bandages but stubbornly upright, was waiting near the control room. His face was pale under the lantern glow, but his eyes held the quiet fire of someone who'd survived too many winters to be cowed by one more. "Doctor says I should rest," Eugene muttered, tapping the metal wall with his wrench. "But I've got 2 good arms and a promise to keep." Jack smiled. "Then let's finish what Carter started." They began clearing debris from the lower passage, the one partially sealed during the storm. The air was dry, filled with the fine smell of old dust and oil. Buddy sniffed along the base of the far wall, ears pricked. He pawed once, then again, whining softly. Eugene frowned. That section shouldn't be hollow. Jack knelt beside the dog, pressing his palm to the cold concrete. A faint echo answered. He looked at Eugene. "Help me with the crowbar." They wedged the tool into the seam between panels and pulled. The wall resisted, then gave with a sharp metallic sigh. Behind it was a narrow cavity, no wider than a closet, sealed from both sides. Inside, half buried in dust, sat a small iron chest, its hinges corroded but intact. Eugene exhaled slowly. "I'll be damned again." They carried the chest to the workbench. The lock had long since rusted, so Jack pried it open carefully with the edge of his knife. The lid creaked, and a gust of air, dry, faintly metallic, escaped. Inside were neatly stacked envelopes, tied with faded blue ribbon. Each envelope bore the same printed return address: Carter Division, U.S. Army Signal Corps, 1945. Postmarks from Colorado, Kansas, even Tennessee marked the corners. And across the top envelope, written in the same deliberate hand that had penned the letter they found earlier, were the words, "For those broken by war, give them back the peace we lost." Eugene's hand trembled as he reached for one. "These aren't just letters," he whispered. "They're pay vouchers, military bonds." He turned the envelope over, revealing a ledger sheet beneath it. Rows of names filled the page, followed by dollar amounts. "They were pooling their wages," Eugene said, voice catching. Carter's men were saving for something. Jack leaned closer. But for what? From behind them came a voice, gentle, curious. "Maybe for the same thing you're trying to build now." Grace stood in the doorway, her auburn hair pulled back beneath a wool cap, cheeks flush from the cold. She wore a gray coat too big for her frame and carried a thermos in both hands. "I brought coffee," she said, smiling softly. "And the town's been asking when you're coming down for breakfast. You've become something of a legend, you know." Eugene chuckled. "I'll eat when I've earned it. Come take a look at this, Miss Turner." Grace stepped closer, eyes widening as she saw the contents of the chest. "These are real?" Jack nodded. "Looks that way. Carter's division must have created a fund, maybe for veterans who came back damaged like me." Grace brushed a gloved finger over the words on the envelope. Then they were ahead of their time. Eugene sat down on a crate, rubbing his temples. If this fund was never claimed, it's still technically government property. But hell, the government forgot this place decades ago. Jack looked from the chest to the old man. "What if we didn't keep it? What if we used it for what they meant it to be?" Grace tilted her head. "You mean reopen the bunker?" "Not as a military site," Jack said quietly. "As something better. A refuge." Eugene looked up, meeting his gaze. "You're talking about a haven." Jack smiled faintly. "Yeah, a haven." They spent the rest of the morning cataloging the envelopes, each carefully sealed and labeled with initials. Eugene cross-checked them against the names in Carter's letter, and the list painted a haunting picture. Dozens of soldiers who'd survived the war, only to vanish into silence afterward. "They never got to use it," Eugene murmured. "Most of these men were killed before 46. Grace took notes on a yellow pad, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Then maybe their money can finally do what they wanted it to. That afternoon, the three of them sat around the workbench drafting plans. Grace, who had a quiet way of organizing chaos, drew up a schedule for repairs. Eugene, between coughs, listed equipment that could be restored. Jack handled logistics, calling in favors from the town's veterans group. Buddy lay at their feet, chin resting on his paws, occasionally looking up whenever someone spoke his name. His presence seemed to calm the room, like a metronome for the heart. When Eugene's hands shook too much to hold a pen, Buddy nudged his knee until the old man smiled again. By dusk, their decision had a name: the Haven Project. Grace was the one who said it aloud first. "A place where silence doesn't hurt anymore?" Jack looked at her, really looked, the way her eyes softened when she said the word silence. He realized she understood that kind of quiet, the kind filled with grief, not peace. He nodded slowly. "Then we start tomorrow." Over the next week, the townspeople came together. The storm had mended something invisible between them, and now that bond carried into work. Henry Boyd brought tools. His sons brought lumber. The local carpenter, Mrs. Keene, built benches from reclaimed pine. Even the high school students volunteered, scrubbing walls and painting signs. Grace taught the children to stencil the project's name across the entrance in bold white letters. Buddy became the heart of it all. He wandered the halls of the bunker, as if it were his duty to make everyone feel safe. When the veterans from nearby counties began to arrive, men with limps, missing fingers, eyes that flinched at sudden sounds, Buddy greeted each one gently, resting his head on their knees until they smiled. One of them, a tall man named Reggie with burn scars across his cheek, whispered to Grace one afternoon, "That dog sleeps better than I do. Maybe he'll teach me how." Grace smiled. "He already has." By the time spring thawed the last of the snow, the bunker had transformed. Warm light spilled from the entryway each evening. The old communications room became a library. The sleeping quarters turned into meditation chambers. And in the very heart of the structure, the same place where the sealed wall had hidden Carter's fund, they built a circular room lined with photographs of soldiers, nurses, and families. On the central plaque, engraved in brass, were the words from Carter's letter. "For those broken by war, give them back the peace we lost." At the dedication ceremony, the townsfolk gathered in a semicircle around the entrance. The wind chime Grace had rehung above the door tinkled softly in the spring breeze. Eugene stood beside Jack and Grace, leaning on a cane, his weathered face alight with pride. Jack spoke simply. "This isn't about fixing the past. It's about giving what's left of it a home." When he finished, Buddy barked once, sharp and clear, as if sealing the vow. That night, as the first veterans settled in, some sitting by the fire, others walking the quiet halls, Jack stepped outside. The stars were bright, the snow finally gone. Grace joined him, her hand brushing his arm. "You did it," she said. He shook his head gently. "No, we all did, even the ones who never came home." From somewhere behind them, the faint hum of the bunker echoed through the ground, steady, alive, and no longer lonely. Spring unfurled gently over Pine Ridge, washing the valley in green after months of white. The pines shimmered with new needles, and the river that once whispered beneath the ice now sang through the ravine like a long-held breath released. The Haven Project had been open for 6 weeks, and every morning the bunker breathed a little easier, its concrete heart no longer a tomb, but a pulse of quiet life. Jack had grown used to the rhythm, coffee with Eugene at dawn, a walk with Buddy around the perimeter, the low hum of conversation echoing from the converted mess hall. Some mornings he still woke from dreams of sand and thunder, but now, when the old ghosts stirred, there was laughter nearby to steady them. The bunker was no longer a place to hide. It was a place to listen. Word had spread far beyond Pine Ridge. Veterans who had heard about the shelter beneath the earth began arriving, some by bus, some on foot, some led there by letters from others like them. The first was Tom Riley, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with graying hair and a scar that ran down his temple like a thread of lightning. He had served with Jack years ago in Kandahar. When he stepped out of the borrowed pickup, his boots crunching gravel, the two men froze for a long moment. Then Tom grinned, that same crooked grin from half a lifetime ago, and clasped Jack's shoulder. "Didn't think I'd find you running a monastery," Tom said. Jack laughed. "Not a monastery, just a place where people can stop pretending they're fine." Tom's eyes softened. "Then maybe I belong here more than I thought." Over the next weeks, more came. A former medic named Sofia Hernandez, short, sturdy, in her 40s, with dark hair streaked silver, brought her teenage son, Daniel, who barely spoke since his father's death overseas. A quiet man named Paul Jennings, who walked with a limp and carried a guitar he rarely played, arrived next. And an older couple, the Brodies, both former Air Force engineers, offered to repair the old generator system. Each brought something: pain, skill, or simply presence. And the haven began to feel like a mosaic of lives once shattered, now gently reassembled. Grace became the quiet architect of their healing. Every afternoon, she turned the old briefing room into an art space. Sunlight filtered through the narrow window slits, catching on brushes and jars of paint. Veterans who once couldn't speak about what they'd seen now sat beside her, sketching pieces of memory: a desert horizon, a friend's initials on a helmet, a pair of dog tags half buried in sand. Grace, in her soft gray sweaters and gentle voice, guided them not to perfection, but to release. "You don't have to draw it right," she'd say. "You just have to draw it out." Eugene taught the mechanical group, men who needed their hands to remember usefulness. He showed them how to rebuild broken radios, weld steel joints, even fix farm engines. His gruff patience masked a deep pride. "Machines," he often said, "don't judge your past. They just ask if you'll try again." Jack led something less tangible. Every evening, in the circular chamber at the heart of the bunker, he gathered whoever wanted to join him. No speeches, no prayers, just silence. At first, it felt strange, a group of soldiers sitting in the dark, breathing. But over time, the silence became its own language. Jack would tell them, "You don't fight the quiet, you let it teach you how to stay." Buddy, ever faithful, moved among them like a spirit of calm. He would rest his head on the knee of the man who trembled the most, or curl beside Daniel when the boy's nightmares returned. Once, during an art session, Grace looked up to see Buddy sitting perfectly still as Sophia painted his portrait. "He knows," she whispered. "He just knows." By midsummer, Pine Ridge had changed. Where once the townsfolk had avoided the ridge, now they brought food, blankets, and company. Henry Boyd organized community dinners. Mrs. Keene built wooden benches for the veterans to sit on outside. The mayor, a soft-spoken man named Leonard Shaw, with thinning hair and an earnest manner, came to tour the facility one bright June afternoon. He stood before the engraved plaque in the central chamber and read aloud, "For those broken by war, give them back the peace we lost." Then he turned to Jack. "You've done something remarkable here, Sergeant. I think it's time the county recognized it." Jack looked uncomfortable. "This wasn't just me, sir." "Exactly," Mayor Shaw said with a smile. "That's what makes it worth honoring." 2 weeks later, under a blue summer sky, the town gathered outside the haven. Lanterns hung from the trees, and children ran with flags made of fabric scraps painted by the veterans. Grace stood beside Jack in a simple white dress, her auburn hair tied back with a ribbon. Eugene, in a clean jacket for once, leaned proudly on his cane. The mayor stepped onto the small wooden platform and spoke to the crowd. "There are many ways to serve your country. Some carry rifles, some carry burdens no one can see, and some, like the people here, carry others." He turned to Jack and presented a small velvet box. "For transforming pain into peace, for turning a place of war into a home of healing, the Pine Ridge Council awards Jack Miller the Community Service Medal." Applause rippled through the crowd. Jack, clearly embarrassed, rubbed the back of his neck and accepted the medal with a quiet nod. "I didn't think peace could come from underground," he said into the microphone. "But maybe that's what healing is, digging deep until you find what still breathes." Behind him, Buddy barked once, a sharp, joyful sound that made the crowd laugh. Grace reached down to pat the dog's head, whispering, "You deserve a medal, too." The local newspaper ran the story the next morning. The headline read, a war bunker turned into a shelter by those it once wounded. The article described how veterans were building furniture for town projects, teaching welding classes at the high school, and helping maintain forest trails. It mentioned Buddy's role as chief therapy dog and Grace's art program that now included children of soldiers. But what the paper didn't capture was the quiet transformation, the way the bunker glowed at night, its windows warm like lanterns beneath a hill, the way laughter now replaced the echo of drills, or how the wind chime above the door had become the symbol of Pine Ridge's renewal. One evening, weeks later, as dusk painted the forest in gold and violet, Jack sat outside watching the last rays sink behind the ridge. Grace joined him, 2 mugs of tea in her hands. "Do you ever think Carter knew this would happen?" she asked. Jack smiled faintly. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he just hoped someone would listen. Buddy rested his head on Jack's boot, eyes half closed. The sound of distant singing drifted from the bunker. Tom on guitar, Sophia humming along, Eugene's rough voice joining in. For a man who once couldn't stand the sound of laughter because it reminded him of the dead, Jack now found it healing. Grace leaned against his shoulder, quiet for a long time. Then she said softly, "Do you hear that?" Jack tilted his head. "The song?" "No," she said. "Peace." He smiled. "Yeah, I do." The wind chimes swayed gently above them, and the night settled, soft, whole, alive. Autumn had returned to Pine Ridge with its quiet grace. The trees were ablaze in gold and amber, their leaves drifting like whispers across the valley. The river ran slow and clear, and the bunker, once a cold relic of war, stood beneath the slope as if it had always belonged there. Moss had grown soft on the outer walls, and a new wooden sign swung gently above the entrance. The Haven, home of peace for all who remember. Jack Miller, now in his mid-50s, leaned on the fence post beside the path, watching the morning light spill over the valley. His hair had silvered at the temples, his beard trimmed short but streaked with white. His hands were still strong, but his movements slower, tempered by years rather than battle. The lines on his face no longer spoke of war. They spoke of work, laughter, and long seasons of quiet. Buddy, the old German shepherd, lay stretched near the door of the bunker. His muzzle was pale now, his fur thinning along the shoulders, but his amber eyes still carried that steady alertness, the same patient warmth that had once pulled men back from the edge of nightmares. He wagged his tail lazily as Jack passed, the thump against the wooden floor, a rhythm older than words. Grace stepped out from the doorway carrying 2 mugs of coffee. The years had softened her beauty, but deepened her presence. Her auburn hair had faded into copper, streaked with silver, and faint lines framed her gray-blue eyes. She wore a shawl of woven wool and a necklace that once belonged to her mother. To the children who now called her Miss Grace, she was both teacher and storyteller, part of the valley itself. "Coffee's still hot," she said, handing him a mug. "You've been staring at that sign for 10 minutes. Jack smiled, taking a sip. "Just making sure I spelled it right." "You spelled it right 3 times, she teased. Then, more softly, "You still don't like calling it home?" He looked at the bunker, the morning sun catching its entrance. "I didn't at first, but now, I think it's always been one. We just didn't know how to open the door." From behind them came Eugene's voice, raspy, amused. "You talk like an old poet, Jack." Eugene, at 83, had grown slower but no less sharp. He wore a flannel jacket several sizes too big and still carried a wrench in his back pocket, just in case. His face was a map of years, each wrinkle drawn by sun, wind, and laughter. Though his steps were uncertain, his spirit was steady as the mountain itself. He joined them by the door, lowering himself onto a bench Buddy once claimed as his own. "Coffee?" Grace asked. Eugene waved her off. Doctor says no caffeine, says it makes my heart race. He winked. But at my age, that might be the only thing that still does. They laughed together, the sound echoing through the pines. Inside the bunker, life hummed quietly. The haven had become more than anyone had dreamed. The front hall now served as a small museum, displaying artifacts found during the renovation, letters, photos, and the rusted insignia of Carter Division preserved behind glass. Visitors came from neighboring towns to see the exhibit, to read about how veterans had turned a war shelter into a sanctuary. Farther in, the old radio chamber had become a therapy room. Veterans sat in circles there, some speaking, some silent, while trained counselors, many of them once patients, guided them through the long work of healing. One of the counselors, Reggie, the burn-scarred Marine, who had once feared mirrors, now led group sessions twice a week. His laughter could be heard clear down the corridor. Across the hall, Grace's storytelling room filled with the voices of children every Saturday. She told them the tale of the silent soldiers, men who had buried letters beneath a mountain, not to hide guilt, but to preserve hope. The children would listen, wide-eyed, as she spoke of Jack, Buddy, and Eugene, though she never quite told it as if it were about them. The heroes of Pine Ridge, she'd call them, the ones who taught the valley how to listen. Buddy was part of every tour. Slow but proud, he'd walk beside each group, letting children pat his head. He no longer barked often, but when he did, the sound was deep and reassuring. To the veterans, he was more than a dog. He was living proof that loyalty outlives fear. One late afternoon, as golden leaves spun through the air, Jack stood on the ridge with Grace. The valley stretched below, dotted with lanterns glowing near dusk. "We should call it what people already do," Grace said. "The light beneath the earth." Jack chuckled. "That's poetic. Must have learned that from you." Grace smiled faintly. "No, from Eugene. He says the bunker's heart glows brighter every year." They turned to see Eugene approaching slowly, his cane tapping in rhythm with each step. "You talking about me again?" he asked, settling onto the nearby bench. His breath came shorter now, his movements careful. Jack could see the fatigue hiding behind his humor. "Always," Grace said softly. "You're the last engineer of the Haven." Eugene's eyes twinkled. "Then let me leave you one more blueprint." He gestured toward the valley. "Keep it open. Don't let it become a monument. Let it stay alive, with laughter, with work, with children." Jack nodded. "We will." Eugene leaned back, eyes drifting toward the fading light. "Good. Because places like this, they don't heal people. People heal each other. The walls just give them permission." That night, Eugene fell asleep by the fire and didn't wake. Grace found him at dawn, the morning light touching his face. His wrench rested on the table beside a folded note addressed to them both. "Keep the lights on. I'll hear them from wherever I am." The following evening, the whole town gathered. Lanterns lined the path to the bunker, flickering like stars guiding him home. Jack spoke briefly, his voice steady. Eugene spent his life keeping others safe, from silence, from darkness, from being forgotten. Tonight, we keep his promise. When the crowd dispersed, only Jack, Grace, and Buddy remained. They sat by the doorway long after the last lantern had burned out. The valley was still, the air cool and fragrant with pine. Grace leaned her head on Jack's shoulder. "He was right," she whispered. "People heal people." Jack's hand brushed over hers. "And dogs help too." Buddy's tail thumped once in agreement. Years rolled gently after that. The Haven continued to grow, a refuge, a museum, a heartbeat under the mountain. Veterans came and went, some stayed, families visited, children planted trees in the garden above. Every plaque, every beam, Every rusted bolt of the bunker told a story of survival. One crisp autumn morning, Jack hung a new sign above the entrance. His fingers, rough with age, moved carefully as he tightened the final screw. Grace stood behind him, her hands folded in her shawl. The letters gleamed in the sunlight. The Haven, home of peace for all who remember. Grace smiled. You finally called it home. Jack stepped back, admiring the sign. I think it always was. We just didn't know how to open the door. Behind them, Buddy lay near the threshold, eyes half closed, nose twitching at the wind. A few children's laughter echoed from the hill, mingling with the sound of leaves skittering across stone. Grace reached for Jack's hand, and for a long while, they simply stood there, listening. Then, from above the doorway, the wind chime rang. Its tone was softer now, worn thin by years, but still pure. The sound carried across the valley, rising and fading like a final benediction. Jack looked up and smiled. You hear that? Grace nodded. They finally found peace. The light from the bunker spilled out, reaching the trees, the meadow, the river, a quiet radiance from the earth itself, shining upward toward a world that had, at last, learned to remember kindly. Years later, people would still visit Pine Ridge just to see the light that came from beneath the earth. Some said it was reflection. Others swore it was something divine, a quiet radiance that rose from the old bunker every evening, as if the mountain itself was remembering those who had once chosen mercy over fear. But those who knew the story understood. The light wasn't in the walls. It was in the hearts of those who rebuilt them. The Haven had become more than a place. It was a living reminder that peace is not the absence of pain, but the courage to turn pain into purpose. Jack, Grace, Eugene, and Buddy had shown that even the broken can become builders, that one act of kindness can ripple through generations, healing what war and silence could not. And when people stood before that humble doorway and read the words, "Home of Peace," for all who remember, many felt something awaken, a belief that miracles are often handmade, built nail by nail through love, forgiveness, and faith. So, tonight, as you finish this story, may you carry a piece of that light with you. Look around. There is always someone near who needs the calm of your voice, the warmth of your presence, the grace of your forgiveness. Because in a world still scarred by noise and division, you can be someone's haven. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what peace means to you. Subscribe and help keep these stories of courage and kindness alive. May God bless you and your loved ones. May His light guide your steps, and may your heart always find its way home.